Okay, I want you to picture a specific type of building. It's designed from the ground up to be, well, chorus. The
Mm.
doors are unlocked.
Mm.
The layout is intentionally confusing because, it's meant to be explored. And the organization running it has this explicit mission to invite total strangers inside, often without asking for ID and usually with a smile.
Sounds like a beautiful concept for a community hub, right?
It does.
Yeah.
Until you look at it through the lens of a security professional.
Then it looks like a nightmare, a
Wow.
total nightmare.
Exactly. It's what the industry calls a uniquely open environment. And today, we are diving into that paradox, the paradox of the church.
Right.
Because we have this stack of documents from the Valortech Church Safety Training Program. And it completely upended how I thought about this.
I can imagine.
I think most people hear church security and they picture, what, a retired cop standing in the back? Or maybe a volunteer usher with a radio?
Or, frankly, just a guy with a concealed carry permit who decided he's going to watch over the congregation.
Right. The classic good guy with a gun archetype. But Valortech is proposing something radically different here. They aren't talking about guards.
No.
They're talking about a massive shift from, like, informal volunteering to structured governance. And honestly, the more I read, the more I realized that the informal way, the way most churches probably do it, is actually a ticking time bomb.
It really is. And the source material highlights a crucial distinction here. It's not just about stopping a bad guy. It's about the fact that churches operate on good intentions.
Yeah.
You have someone who wants to help, so you let them help. Valortech argues that in the realm of safety, good intentions are not a strategy.
Your reliability.
Exactly. Without structured governance, those good intentions are a liability magnet.
Let's get into that liability right away, because this was the part of the research that really surprised me.
Yeah.
I assumed the biggest risk to a church was an active shooter. But the source suggests the more immediate threat is actually legal.
It's the aftermath. The text explicitly states, and I'm paraphrasing a bit, for churches, the greater risk is often not the incident itself, but the scrutiny and liability that follow.
Wow.
Think about it. An incident happens, police arrive, the dust settles, then the lawsuits start. And if your safety program was just Bob and Dave watching the doors, the church is in deep, deep trouble.
The documents use some heavy legal terminology here. Vicarious liability and negligent entrustment. I want to unpack these because they sound terrifyingly bureaucratic, but the implications are huge. Let's start with vicarious liability.
So vicarious liability essentially shreds the whole lone wolf defense.
The idea that if a volunteer messes up, the church can just say, well, we didn't tell him to do that.
Exactly. Let's create a scenario. You have a volunteer safety team member. We'll call him Bob. Bob sees someone raising their voice in the lobby. Bob gets heated. Maybe he's having a bad day, and he tackles this person.
Good.
Injures them. Now, intuition says Bob is an adult. Bob made a bad choice. Bob is responsible.
Right. Why is the church on the hook for Bob's temper tantrum?
Because the church authorized Bob. By giving him a badge, a radio, or even just the verbal designation of security, the church made Bob an agent of the institution.
Well,
Under vicarious liability, the organization is responsible for the actions of its agents. You can't delegate authority and then just abdicate responsibility when it goes sideways.
so by saying, Bob, watch the door, the leadership is essentially handing Bob the church's checkbook and reputation.
In a way, yes. And that leads us directly into the darker concept, negligent entrustment.
Right.
This is where the source suggests the church is actually more at fault than Bob.
How is that possible?
Negligent entrustment asks, did you know, or should you have known, that Bob was unfit for this role?
Oof.
If Bob has a known history of aggression, or if he's physically incapable of handling a threat without using excessive force, and you put him in that position anyway, that isn't an accident. That is negligence.
That's a heavy burden. It means you can't just take volunteers at face value.
You can't. And then there's negligent training. If you recruit a team but don't give them specific documented standards on how to handle a threat, you failed to establish a standard of care.
Right.
Valortech points out that if you end up in court, the plaintiff's attorney is going to ask for your training logs. They're going to ask for your standard operating procedures. If your answer is, we just told them to keep an eye out, you have effectively lost the case before it starts.
This helps explain why the Valortech program is so incredibly dense. I mean, it's not just about learning tactics. It's about building a defensible system.
That's the word.
They talk about aligning with Florida Class D and Class G licensing pathways.
Which is a brilliant move for defensibility. By using a state-licensed academy curriculum, the church isn't just making up its own rules.
It's an objective standard.
It's an objective, external standard. It shifts the posture from we have some volunteers to we have a governed, licensed program.
So let's look at what that program actually entails, because when I saw the hourly requirements, I did a double take. The unarmed program alone is 50 hours
50 hours, that's more than a full work week.
for a volunteer role. And remember, this is the unarmed track. No weapons. I have to play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
What could you possibly be teaching for 50 hours if you aren't teaching them how to shoot? Is this just padding?
It's definitely not padding. In fact, Valor Tech would argue this is the most critical 50 hours. The goal here is a prevention-focused, visible, non-lethal capability.
Okay.
If you look at the breakdown, phase 1 is environment and risk, which includes something called scenario mapping.
I saw that. They listed things like disruptive individuals, medical emergencies, and domestic spillover.
Let's focus on domestic spillover for a second,
Yeah.
because that is a massive blind spot for most informal security teams.
How so?
We tend to fantasize about the outsider threat, the stranger storming the gates. But churches are communities. People bring their personal lives, their messy divorces, their custody battles right into the building with them.
So you're talking about a situation where, say, a non-custodial parent shows up to pick up a kid from Sunday school.
Precisely. That is a security crisis. It's high stakes, high emotion, and potentially violent. But it is not an active shooter event.
Right.
You cannot treat a father trying to see his kids like a terrorist, but you also cannot allow an unauthorized pickup.
That's a nightmare scenario for a volunteer.
Yeah.
If the mom says he can't have him, but there's no court order on file, or the volunteer doesn't know where the file is.
Exactly. If that volunteer hasn't been trained on unauthorized pickup prevention and legal guardianship protocols, they panic. They might physically block a parent they have no legal right to stop, which leads to a lawsuit.
Or what?
Or they might hand the child over to avoid a scene, which leads to a tragedy. Valor Tech's 50-hour curriculum forces them to role-play these nuances. It shifts the focus from muscle to policy application.
Which connects to phase 2, behavior and intervention. The source uses this phrase I love, maintaining dignity while preserving order. That feels like a very, very fine line to walk.
It is the hardest balance in the industry. You are in a sanctuary. The mission is spiritual. You cannot treat a disruptive person like a criminal on the street.
Yeah.
The training covers early threat recognition without escalation. You have to distinguish between someone who is a threat and someone who is just emotionally distressed.
Right. Someone wailing in the front row might be having a mental health crisis or, a spiritual breakthrough. If your security team treats them like a hostile target, you've failed the ministry's mission.
And you've probably escalated the situation. That's why the psychology component is so heavy in the unarmed track. It's about verbal de-escalation and tone control.
They also cover medical readiness in this phase, things like bleeding control and EMS interface.
Which is just statistically smart. A church gathering is far more likely to see a cardiac arrest or a slip and fall than a gunfight.
Much more likely.
If your safety team can't handle a tourniquet or manage a scene until the ambulance arrives, they aren't really keeping people safe, they're just waiting for a fight.
Okay, so that's the foundation. 50 hours of law, psychology, medical, and procedure. Now, let's talk about the armed program.
Okay.
This is where the commitment jumps to 75 hours. And I have to be honest, when I read 75 hours, my first thought was, who has time for this? These are volunteers with day jobs.
It's a huge ask.
Is Valor Tech trying to turn deacons into Navy SEALs? It feels excessive for a Sunday morning greeting team.
It feels excessive until you look at the sanctuary density charts in the source.
The what?
Sanctuary density. It's a concept Valor Tech leans on heavily to justify the training time. They make the point that a church sanctuary is arguably a more difficult shooting environment than a police encounter on the street.
How so? Really?
Think about the geometry. In a typical police engagement, you might have a backdrop of, say, a brick wall or a car.
Okay.
In a sanctuary, you have 360 degrees of innocent bystanders.
Okay.
You have people in front of the threat, behind the threat. You have kids moving erratically. You have choir members up on a stage.
Okay, I see your point. If you miss on the street, you hit a wall. If you miss in a sanctuary.
You hit a parishioner. You hit a child. The worship environment safety rules in the text emphasize backdrop awareness as a life or death calculation. So the 75 hours isn't just about learning to shoot.
It's about learning not to shoot.
It's about learning not to shoot when the pressure is absolutely crushing.
That explains the core distinction the source makes right at the beginning of the arms section. Carrying is not equivalent to being trained.
That is a bold statement, but a necessary one. A concealed carry permit usually requires a basic safety class and hitting a static target. That does not qualify you to engage a threat in a crowded room with bad lighting and screaming people.
And I noticed that the armed track includes the unarmed core curriculum as a prerequisite. You can't just skip to the range time.
No, you must build on that foundation of prevention. If your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. If your only tool is a firearm, you are a liability. An armed team member has to be an expert in de-escalation first. If they have to draw their weapon, it means the prevention phase, those first 50 hours, has failed.
Let's talk about the range time, though, because Phase 3 describes measurable skill. This isn't just casual range participation.
No.
They mention specific marksmanship standards with defined scoring benchmarks.
It demands accountability. ValorTech aligns this with the Florida Class G license standards, which is the standard for armed security officers. This includes things like draw stroke and holster discipline.
Which sounds technical, but why is that so prominent?
Because that is where most negligent discharges happen. Drawing a weapon under stress is a fine motor skill that degrades rapidly when your heart rate spikes.
Right. Adrenaline dump.
Yeah. If you haven't drilled that mechanic thousands of times, you are more likely to shoot yourself or the person next to you than the actual threat.
And Phase 4 focuses on judgment under stress. This seems to be the capstone. They talk about false positive control.
This is the difference between shooting and fighting. False positive control is the ability to distinguish a credible threat from just ambiguous behavior.
Give me an example of ambiguous behavior in a church.
Someone reaches into their coat quickly during a service. Are they pulling a gun? Or are they pulling out their phone because it just buzzed?
Or reaching for a tissue.
Or a tissue, exactly. If you have an armed volunteer who is hyper-vigilant but poorly trained, they might perceive that movement as a threat.
And if they draw on someone reaching for a tissue?
The church is over.
Yeah.
The trauma inflicted on the congregation, the legal fallout, the reputational ruin. That is why decision-making, escalation versus disengagement, is so heavily drilled. Sometimes the right move is to wait. Sometimes the right move is to retreat. The training forces the student to make those split-second decisions before they are holding a live weapon in a service.
So we have these two tracks, unarmed and armed, but they don't operate in silos, right? The synthesis section of the source talks about decision-making and the human element. How do these two groups actually work together?
They have to be integrated. The source discusses team dynamics and response roles.
Okay.
Usually the unarmed team is the first line of defense. They are the ones doing the verbal de-escalation and tone control.
So the armed team is what? Just waiting in the wings.
In a sense, yes. They are a layer of protection that is designed to be invisible until absolutely necessary. The source mentions the need for clear communication protocols.
Right.
If an unarmed member sees that domestic spillover situation getting physical, how do they signal the armed member without causing a panic? That handoff has to be seamless.
So it effectively creates concentric circles of safety. The unarmed team handles the 99% of issues that are behavioral or medical.
Correct.
The armed team is there strictly for the lethal threat.
Exactly. But there is one more concept in this section that I found really interesting, and it circles back to the leadership challenge we started with, the unfit individual.
This is the part that I think will keep pastors and board members up at night. Because in church culture, inclusion is the name of the game.
Of course.
You want people to serve. You want people to feel useful.
Right. But ValorTech puts a hard stop here.
Imagine telling Brother Jim, who's been a member for 20 years and tithes every week, that he can't be on the safety team because he's too hot-headed.
Yeah.
Or because he has a hero complex. That is a political nightmare.
It is awkward. It is uncomfortable. But the source frames this as a moral duty rather than just an administrative one. They argue that allowing an unfit person to serve in a safety capacity is actually a failure of love.
A failure of love? How?
Because you are setting them up to fail. If you know someone lacks the emotional maturity or the physical capability to handle a crisis, and you put them in a position where they might face life or death decisions,
You're not helping them.
you are exposing them to criminal liability and immense psychological trauma. You aren't rejecting them, you are protecting them from a role they cannot handle.
That's a powerful reframe. It goes back to that negligent entrustment idea. By saying, no, you are actually protecting the church and the individual.
Exactly. The program includes eligibility and selection guidance, specifically to help leaders navigate this. It creates an objective standard. You aren't saying, I don't like you, Jim. You're saying, the standard for this role requires X, Y, and Z, and we have to stick to the standard for the insurance and legal protection of the church.
It takes the personality out of it.
Which is the goal of the entire program, moving from personality-driven to process-driven.
So let's try to pull this all together. We've looked at the terrifying liability of the good intention model. We've looked at the 50-hour unarmed prevention track, the 75-hour armed governance track, and the human element of vetting. What is the ultimate takeaway here?
For me, it boils down to a phrase the source uses. Operational readiness combined with organizational defensibility.
You need both.
You have to have both. Readiness being the ability to actually handle the bad thing when it happens.
Yes. Can your team stop a threat? Can they save a life?
Right. That's readiness. But defensibility is, can you survive the aftermath? Can you prove in court that you did everything right? Can you show the documentation, the training logs, the background checks?
And you really can't have one without the other.
No. A documented program that sits in a binder but is never practiced is just useless paper. But a highly skilled team that operates like a rogue militia with no oversight is a lawsuit waiting to happen.
Right.
Valortech is trying to bridge that gap.
It really is a shift from we're just volunteers to we are professionals providing a ministry.
Exactly. It professionalizes the protection of the flock.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. From the legal definitions that define agency to the geometry of a sanctuary shootout. It's heavy stuff, but necessary.
It is.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over. We talked a lot about how churches are built on openness and good intentions. But the source material we dove into today suggests that in the high-stakes world of safety, good intentions are simply not enough. In fact, they can be a blinder.
Dangerous one.
So here's the question. If your organization, whether it's a church, a nonprofit, or a club, have a safety team that exists without these documented standards, without the vetting, without the rigorous training, are you actually reducing your risk? Or, by giving yourself a false sense of security and opening yourself up to massive liability, have you actually increased the danger to the very people you're trying to protect?
That is the question every leader needs to look in the mirror and ask.
Something to think about next time you walk through those open doors. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Stay safe.
We'll see you next time.